Good morning, students. Today we'll be discussing the story titled Professor Shonku and UFO by Satyajit Ray. I have already shared the PDF. I hope you have read the short story. So let us begin. So I will give you a brief introduction to Satyajit Ray. Though this is a person who doesn't need an introduction at all. Akira Kurosawa, a world-renowned film director who directed Rashomon, he once said about Satyajit Ray like this, that not to have seen the films of Satyajit Ray is like existing in the world without seeing sun or moon. That shows the genius of Satyajit Ray. But we always associate Satyajit Ray with films, and this is a kind of a short story which will take us to understand Satyajit Ray more. He was actually a man of versatility. He worked as a commercial artist. He was an advertisement designer. He was even a calligrapher, and he was even creator of all those Bengali fonts like Ray Roman, Ray Bizarre. It had all those strange names. And he was also a good musician, a publisher. He was illustrator for various magazines, and he had own publications in which he was an illustrator as well. Along with that, he was the author of popular fiction and children literature. And as I said earlier, most importantly, he is known as the world-renowned filmmaker. The films which had that deep observation, the films that showed understanding and love for the human race, and most importantly, it portrayed realistic Indian life. And let us move to the next slide. Satyajit Ray as an author of popular fiction. He was equally good in popular fiction and children's literature as well. He was the editor of Sandesh, which was a magazine meant for children, and he was the creator of very popular detective series titled Adventures of Feluda. He was a writer of stories which primarily targeted at children and adolescents. But as with all good literature for children anywhere in the world, his books can be enjoyed both by children and adults. He never treated, and the most important point is that he never treated his young readers as less intelligent or less receptive when compared to adults. He always liked to believe that children have significantly more fertile imagination than older readers. So that is completely opposite to all those popular perception. He believed that they are far more welcoming of chills and thrills than their older counterparts. So he treated children as equal as adults. They are as intelligent and receptive as just like adults. Coming to the short story series titled Professor Shonku. The Shonku stories first appeared in Bengali in the children's magazine Sandesh in 1961. And this magazine, which was started by Satyajit Ray's grandfather, Ubendra Kishore Ray Chowdhury, in 1930, and it was revived by Ray himself in 1961. So, this is the magazine where he published these series of stories of Professor Shonku. Called Byom Chatir Diary of a Space Traveler. This is the story of a man who approaches the editor of a magazine with a diary written by one Professor Shanku. So this is the way this short story, this series of story starts. Yeah, as you have read the short story, you see all those diary entries. So it is not Professor Shanku speaking directly. We see uh, his diaries. So this is a diary which is which was maintained by Professor Shanku. So this editor gets this diary and he publishes it. And in all, Ray wrote and published 40 adventures, the last two appearing only as incomplete draft. Out of these, 18 were written for the annual editions of Anandamela, another popular children's magazine, and Ray continued to write and captivate audience with Shanku escapades for the next 30 odd years. It ran for next 30 years. And about the character Professor Shanku. So, this Professor Shanku, is a scientist who lived and worked in a small, quiet town of Girid in Jharkhand. And in this diary, Shanku describes how he has developed a rocket for space travel and also a robot named Biddu Shekhar. Soon he leaves for Mars in the rocket with Biddu Shekhar, his assistant Prahlad, and Newton the cat. Though this journey to Mars is eventful, he finds that the beings living there in the Mars, they are not at all welcoming. So finally, at the end of the series, he finds a new home on the planet Alpha where he plans to stay on. On Earth, all that remains are his diaries. So he had a whole series of diaries recounting his astounding discoveries, inventions, and amazing adventures. And he has world-renowned scientists across globe as his collaborators. And now his diary notes are being published, and that is why you see all those short stories in the form of diary entries. And in Shanku, we see that Ray created a character which is the ideal, which is a symbol of ideal science. So he is a person, Professor Shanku is a person who wanted to use science to find cures, to invent new machines for the betterment of the humanity. And in it, strangely, interestingly, he invents a set of objects which he uses. Professor Shanku uses annihilin, that is his pistol. And interesting part is that that pistol can simply erase a person from the scene. We all need that, right? And there is this miracle, the wonder drug. And remembering, which revives memory. We all need that too. Ornithone, to impart lessons to birds. And there is also a machine which translates any language into English, that is lingua graph. And he has this invention named Telus, which has an answer to any question, just like Google. So these are the things which set of inventions which we see in these series of stories. And coming to the observations on Satyajit Ray's science fictions, Satyajit Ray's science fictions become unique with the quality of humanness. The quality of humanness associated with his science fiction. He viewed science and science fiction, he always associated science and science fiction with humanness. Usually, what we lack in science fiction is humanness, the element of humanity, all those human emotions like empathy, sympathy, all those virtues which we associate with human beings are something which we see, we will not see in all those science fiction. That makes the works of Satyajit Ray unique. His science fiction were always centered on people located in familiar surroundings. So, as I said earlier, Ray created the ideal man of science who wanted to use science to find cures, to invent machines without craving for monetary benefits or fame. So, here there is a story titled Professor Rondi's Time Machine, where it talks about the Italian scientists who want to use a time machine to make money by giving people a ride to past or future. And here in the story, Professor Shonku says like this: I have realized that he is not at all thinking of historians or researchers. All he wants is to make utmost profit through this machine. Therein lies a massive gap between his ethos and mine. So here he brings out his philosophy, his view on science, his view that science should be used for the betterment of humanity. And we see that the element of universality and collaborations, he collaborate with other scientists, and his major aim is, usually these scientists are very selfish. They will not they will always keep their ideas, their concepts as secret, because they want the title of the inventor for himself, for themselves. So here we see the element of universality and collaborations. Though Professor Shonku is ambitious, he wanted to use this his inventions to help the humanity. And Ray has also envisioned many future inventions like artificial intelligence, machine translation in these series of stories. So Professor Shonku mixes adventures as part of science fiction. And it is a little different from his another series of stories titled The Adventure of Feluda. And this is what Ray's son says about the difference between these two books, these two volumes of stories. He says, Baba took Feluda to places that he went to and loved, but he took Shonku to places that he wanted to visit but never could. So we see in this story, in this particular story, Professor Shonku and UFO, we see Professor Shonku going to Paris, going to all those European countries. So he took children to all those places which they will never be able to visit. And ultimately, what stands out in these stories in Shonku is a sense of curiosity. Ray was writing these stories primarily for children and young adults at a time when traveling was not at all easy. It is the time when even this internet had never come into being. So to these children, he opened a world of intellectual wonder while taking them on an hair-raising adventures from the poles to the deepest jungles. So this is the summary of the story. Professor Shonku notes about his discoveries in contacting life from other planets and his encounter with, it talks about his encounter with a frustrated, disgruntled Italian researcher named Carboni, who is the villain in this story, who also claimed contact with UFO. UFO is unidentified flying object. And a decade later, there is several sightings of UFOs which makes headlines worldwide. However, this news is outdone by the news of demolition, all those destruction of all those great monuments of mankind. He hears the news of the destruction of Eiffel Tower, Angkor Wat Temple, and aliens are blamed for this. And he takes, Professor Shanku takes Nakur Babu, that is Nakur Chandra Bishwas, who is a clairvoyant and psychic friend of Professor Shanku, to identify the UFO. They go to Gobi Desert. So Nakur Babu says that he could sense UFO in Gobi Desert. So they decide to go together. And Professor Shanku and his international scientist friends explore Gobi Desert, and ultimately they find UFO. But when they enter this UFO, they see that they can't find any aliens there, and they realizes that Carboni is in control of UFO, and he takes Shanku and his team into his custody, and he says that all the aliens who were present in this UFO, they are all dead because of influenza. They couldn't survive in the environment of the earth. And Carboni is out there. His major aim is to take revenge upon society who rejected his plan for a city. So he is there to vent out his frustrations on society by using aliens' weapons to destroy humanity's heritage. And his next target is Taj Mahal. And Nakurta, using his psychic powers, make Carboni believe that he has moved to past before Taj Mahal's construction, and there is confusion after that. And in that confusion, Carboni is killed by the robot present in the UFO, which actually guards this spaceship. And UFO moves back to Gobi Desert and leaves Earth after the team of scientists disembarks. So these are the themes in Professor Shanku and UFO. Here we see the creative use of science versus its destructive use. And Professor Shanku, as I told earlier, he is the representative of the ideal use of science, creative use of science for the betterment of humanity. And on the other side, there is Carboni, who becomes the representative of those who use science for destructive purpose, for evil purpose. And it has this theme of universality and international spirit of science in service of humanity, as I told earlier. And it also brings this strange theme that we are not alone. The Earth is not the only planet which have living beings. There are friendly life across the universe. So that is the kind of a theme which you usually see in science fictions. And the interesting element you see in this series of short stories is the mixing of traditional knowledge system with modern science. Traditional knowledge system available in India with modern science. So it gives some kind of quality which children in India can associate with. So he has this psychic friend who could sense, who could actually create a world which other people can see, and they believe it to be true. So he is actually a clairvoyant, a psychic friend who uses this traditional knowledge system. So here we see a strange mixture of traditional knowledge and modern science. So that makes it more unique. The works of Satyajit Ray. So for a children of a certain generation and their children now, Professor Shonku is as much as a figment of literary imagination, just like a friend who whisper in their ears, who persuade them to go out there. That is to inculcate that spirit of adventure to a friend who persuade them to ask questions. That is to inculcate in them this spirit of inquisitiveness, which tells us, which tells these children not to be scared of thinking of solutions, not to be scared of asking questions, not to be scared of thinking solutions, no matter how extraordinary they may be at first today. All those innovations. So we end our discussions on Professor Shonku and UFO. Those who haven't read it, please read it and come back to this lecture. Hope it is clear. Thank you, girls. Have a nice day.